Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today my concept of non-local consciousness based on scientific research on near-death experience, NDE, in survivors of cardiac arrest, and especially to discuss into more detail the mystery of perception during such an experience. A near-death experience or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma still give rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. But as already 1 century ago William James has said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories or even verifiable perceptions from a period of obvious unconsciousness? In my recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience, I write in many more details about my ideas about non-local consciousness than I can explain here today in my lecture. But I also realize that many aspects of consciousness and perception are still a great mystery. First, I would like to discuss some of my ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. And I realize that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. Important questions for me were, how was consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? Is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? How is it possible that sometimes patients can report enhanced consciousness when they are unconscious under general anesthesia during surgery? Could there be still consciousness when someone in coma has been declared brain dead by his neurologist and the procedure of organ donation should be started? Or when someone is clinical dead during cardiac arrest? I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 survivors of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. For me, it all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concepts, it is not possible to experience consciousness with the possibility of perception during a cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that there is a reductionist and materialist explanation for everything, and that it was obvious that consciousness was a product of a functioning brain. But now the phenomenon of near-death experience raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? How does the content of an NDE come about? How is it possible that patients can describe veridical details of their own resuscitation or operation? I was unable to accept most of the answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. And many circumstances have been described during which NDE are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, during depression, isolation, or meditation. So apparently you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report an NDE. The NDE is transformational, always causing enhanced intuitive sensitivity, profound changes in life insight, and the loss of the fear of death. And the effects on patients seem similar worldwide across all cultures and all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual, cultural, and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and interpret the experience. According to a recent at-random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 9 million people in the USA, 600,000 people in the Netherlands, and about 20 million people in Europe must have had a near-death experience. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about their NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. You have to be open to hear about an NDE. Patients must feel that you trust them and that you can listen without any comment or prejudice. But for most physicians, the NDE is still an incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. So in 1988, we started a prospective study in 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals, with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause and content of an NDE. And this cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper when our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, or demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. And we additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interview of all late survivors within the 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. And this longitudinal study was designed to assess if the transformation following an NDE is the result of having an NDE or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself. It was never been done in a prospective design. So the definition of clinical death was used for the period of unconsciousness caused by anoxia, of lack of oxygen in the brain due to the arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during ventricular fibrillation in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. And during clinical death, patients have no breathing, no measurable blood pressure, no body reflexes, nor any brainstem reflexes. And these patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model to the process of dying. And in cases where memories were reported, we coded the experience according to a weighted core experience index. And in this system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. And the more elements were reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the resulting score was. What we found is that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. But 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 12%, 41, had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher, and 21, 6%, had a superficial NDE. And in our follow-up research into transformational processes after NDE, we found a significant difference between patients with an NDE compared with those without this experience. Patients with NDE did not show any fear of death. They strongly believed in an afterlife. Their insight in what is important in life had changed, and they often experienced enhanced intuitive sensitivity. And this process of transformation took several years to consolidate, with periods of homesickness, depression, and loneliness. So it's also a trauma. Now, which elements of the NDE were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light or observed colors. About 30% of the patients had an observation of a celestial landscape or had a meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a life review, and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE, but I know personally patients who had a frightening NDE. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found to our surprise that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, so the severity of anoxia of the brain, nor the duration of unconsciousness, so nor the need for intubation in uncomplicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation in the cath lab had any influence whatsoever on the frequency on NDE. NS is not significant. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, gender, religion, or education. Atheists or Christians of witness didn't matter at all. Several theories have been proposed to explain an NDE. However, in our first prospective study ever, it could not be shown that physiological, psychological, or pharmacological factors cause these experiences during cardiac arrest. With a purely physiological explanation, such as lack of oxygen in the brain, most patients who had been clinical dead should report an NDE because all patients in our study had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain resulting from the cardiac arrest. However, only 18% reported an NDE. And why only 18% report an NDE after cardiac arrest is still a big mystery. Besides, it is a well-established fact that people without any lack of oxygen in the brain, like in depression or meditation, can also experience an enhanced consciousness. Another theory holds that the NDE might be a changing state of consciousness, or the theory of continuity, in which memories, identity, and cognition with emotion function independently from the unconscious body and retain the possibility of so-called extrasensory perception. In 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, which was the only study with statistical analysis, 1 study from the USA and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 survivors of cardiac arrest. Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. The paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought process during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation to brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain, that consciousness and memories are produced by large groups of neurons and are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG? Scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. And then, if deceased acquaintances of relatives are encountered and seen in another worldly dimension, they are usually recognized by their appearance, and communication is possible through thought transfer. Quote, during my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship, my father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War. And my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before, during my NDE, turned out to be my biological father. So I have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, all these reported perceptions during NDE-OB were experienced during a transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and of the brainstem with a flatline EEG. Our enhanced consciousness resides not in our brain and is not limited to our brain because our consciousness is non-local and our brain has a facilitating function and not a producing function to experience consciousness. And moreover, when all functions of the cortex and brainstem have ceased during cardiac arrest, when the eyes are closed, or when the pupils are widened and not reacting to light anymore, and the EEG is flatlined, it sometimes happens that people can experience a clear consciousness outside their body with the possibility of veridical perceptions out and above their lifeless body. However, this is possible according to our current medical knowledge. In all those reported and corroborated cases with veridical perception during NDE, the reception ability of the brain and the eyes was obviously lost. The connection between the brain and consciousness was temporarily interrupted. But apparently, non-local consciousness with the possibility of perception still existed. So we don't need a functioning brain, nor a functioning eye, nor a functioning optical nerve to have perceptions. But obviously, we need a functioning brain to share with others this veridical perception that occurred during cardiac arrest or coma. For me, it seems obvious that non-local consciousness itself is that perceives, because it's only our consciousness that is determining how we perceive our subjective reality. Everything originates from consciousness. But how this perception is possible is still a great mystery. Thank you for your attention.